For my midterm project, I decided to research and write about Mary Bradley Lane and her novel Mizora. We're going to be talking about who Mary Bradley Lane was and exactly how her feminist and social utopian novel fits into the late 19th century feminist conversation. All right, let me share my screen. Present. So, who exactly was or is Mary Bradley Lane? Well, that's a bit of a difficult question to answer. Just about any and every source you can find, any papers written about her, any presentations, they all seem to mention how very little is known about her life and who she was, aside from her being born on July 3rd, 1844, and that she's the author of the second recorded complete female utopian novel. This information, or lack thereof, seems pretty disheartening. Why doesn't anyone know anything about this mysterious woman? And is she really so mysterious, or was her story simply lost to history? What we do know. According to a few old scattered newspaper clippings and articles here and there, we have a few small pieces of concrete information. We know Mizora was originally copyrighted under the name Mary E. Bradley in 1890. We know that in 1975, Gregg Publishing Edition listed the author as Mary E. Bradley Lane. We know that in the first edition copy in the Library of Congress, Lane has been appended to the author's surname in pencil. And we know that besides Mizora, Mary Bradley Lane, under the pseudonym of Vera Zarevich, published a short story in the Cincinnati Gazette entitled The Magic Lens. A Glimmer of Hope, Jean Felser. I'm sorry if that's not how you pronounce it, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it for the rest of the presentation because I'm not sure. So while Mary Bradley Lane remains almost a complete mystery to almost everyone else, there is one person who managed to find a good bit of the puzzle that is our mysterious author's life. Jean Felser is somewhat of a foremost expert on Mary Bradley Lane, having written one monograph on the utopian novel, one book chapter on Mizora, and the introduction to Syracuse's 2000 edition of Mizora. Felser provides us with the most detailed biography of Mary E. Bradley Lane in that introduction. So the introduction. We can only wonder why Mary Ellen Bradley Lane, born July 3rd, 1844 to 1920-something, wrote such a trenchant anti-male satire within 3 years of her marriage. Lane was the daughter of Eliza Jane Mackay Bradley and Jacob Bradley, a rural doctor who served as a staff physician for the Union Army. She was raised in the village of St. Mary, now located in Glaze County, Ohio. For a time, she taught at a public school in Mercer County, boarding with a local family until, in September of 1878, she married Thomas A. Lane, a Cincinnati attorney and Civil War veteran whom she had met when she was 10 years old. At the time of their marriage, she was 34 and he was 44. They immediately moved to Cincinnati, where he practiced law, and within a few years they moved to Mount Healthy, a village outside of Cincinnati, and later to a farm 4 miles from a nearby village, Transit. The author of a tale organized around the sentiments, wisdom, and responsibilities of motherhood, Lane had no children of her own. Apparently, she wrote only one other book, Escanaba, in 1895, named after a town in Michigan, but no copy can be located. Thomas Lane died in 1908, and Mary repeatedly wrangled with the federal government over her small widow's pension, suggesting that money was a serious concern. She died near Transit sometime after 1928, the last time I can place her. All right, so the aftermath of a little-known woman. We don't even know the date of Mary Bradley Lane's death, although the online science fiction encyclopedia claims it's January 6, 1930. We also don't know much of her work besides Mizora, so gauging its popularity is difficult. We know that it achieved popularity within the literary circles of Cincinnati and the Ohio River Valley, who were able to access it as the readership of the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette. We see this in this 1881 letter to the editor of the newspaper, dated January 31st, 1881. To the editor of the Commercial, has the narrative of Vera Zarevich been published in book form, and if so, where can I get it, and what is the price? Address and oblige J.W. Franks, Cornersville, Marshall County, Texas. That remarkable narrative has never been published in any form other than that in which it appears in the columns of the Commercial. It will, we presume, be published in book form. The editor's response. That is not the only instance of Vera Zarevich receiving fan letters addressed to the editor, and it is perhaps the many letters such as those that prompted him to write the following quote as the introduction to the first edition of Mizora. The narrative of Vera Zarevich attracted a great deal of attention. It commanded a wide circle of readers, and there was much more said about it than is usual when works of fiction run through a newspaper in weekly installments. Quite a number of persons who were unaccustomed to bestowing consideration upon the works of fiction spoke of it and grew greatly interested in it. I received many messages about it and letters of inquiry, and some ladies and gentlemen desired to know the particulars about the production of the story in book form. So, why don't we remember it? The original popularity of Mizora is also guessed at by some scholars writing on the book or on Lane. According to Segal, despite Halstead's pre-publication hype in the introduction to the 1890 edition, beyond what commercial editor Murat Halstead called Our Limited Literary World of presumably Cincinnati or the Ohio Valley, the novel apparently created no stir once it was reprinted. Few original copies survive, and Mary Lane remains a comparatively unfamiliar name to scholars of American history, literature, and feminism. Balzer, however, describes the book as having risen to popularity. This is corroborated by one of Mizora's reviewers, who describes the sales of the book as extraordinary. Overshadowed and humiliated. Unfortunately, around the same time as the first publication of Mizora, the arguably much more successful and recognized utopian novel of the time, Looking Backwards by Edward Bellamy, was also published, effectively shunting Mizora under the rug of the collective consciousness. This promoted outrage from the forgotten author, enough for her to immediately call plagiarism on Bellamy, claiming she had submitted her novel to Houghton Mifflin first, and that they kept it just long enough to copy its plot and publish it under a different name with a different author. She soon became the laughingstock of the literary community, though not without some biased support from her fellow Cincinnatians, though all in all her claims were completely disregarded. A woman, Vera Zarevich, accuses Edward Bellamy of plagiarism, saying that the idea in Looking Backward was worked out by her in a serial story published in the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette 8 years ago. But the essential idea under dispute is older by about 19 centuries than either Mr. Bellamy or Vera Zarevich, and to support her charge, the latter must show that her plan of elaboration has been copied in Looking Backward, which of course she does not do. Mr. Bellamy has never claimed anything more than the new use of the old idea, and that is unquestionably his. The same is doubtless to be said of a charge made by J.W. Sullivan in the 20th century newspaper that Henry George stole his Progress in Poverty from a book on the theory of human progression, published in 1850 by Patrick E. Dorr, a Scotchman, wherein the private monopolization of land is held to be a cause of poverty. That, too, is quite an old idea, but only one Progress in Poverty has ever been written, and Henry George is undoubtedly its author. So now, what exactly is Mizora? For starters, its full title is quite a mouthful. Mizora, a Prophecy, a manuscript found among the private papers of Princess Vera Zarevich, being a true and faithful account of her journey to the interior of the earth, with its careful description of the country and its inhabitants, their customs, manners, and government. After being exiled from her home and family, Vera Zarevich, sound familiar, finds herself in Mizora, a civilization at the center of the earth made up entirely of women. The novel recounts her experiences there and what she learns during the time there in this utopian society. Details of the society. The book depicts an all-female utopia existing within the earth. The Mizorans practice eugenics. All of them are Aryan-presenting and disdain people of darker skin. Of course, by these standards, and with retrospect in our corner, we know just how inherently racist this novel as a whole is, but it's simply a product of its time, in my opinion. Mizora's history follows loosely to that of America's history, in which society, particularly men, dissolves following a bloody civil war raging against the men who end up destroying themselves during and after the battles are finished. In its ancient history, the land was ruled by a military general elected president, which is a version of Ulysses S. Grant. When the general ran for a third term, as Grant was urged to do in 1880, the society of Mizora descended into chaos. Eventually, a new all-female society order arose. The last men were eliminated, though it is not clear whether they were overtly killed or left to die out. It's said that men are more forgotten than hated. But who is Vera Zarevich? Throughout the novel, not only is there ideas pulled from American history, but of oppressive Russian history as well, The main character, Vera Zarevich, is a young political fugitive who has fallen foul for the Tsarist regime and been sentenced to exile in Siberia. She ends up in Mizora through a stroke of fate when her kayak bound northward is swept up into a waterfall leading straight to the center of the earth and down to Mizora. She spends 15 years there, learning the ways of the culture, and at the end of the time, she longs to return to her husband and child and to teach her own society what she has learned. Although Vera ultimately manages to return to her own society, her husband and son are dead, and a Mizorian friend dies as well. Vera is left only with the hope that future generations will be better off through the promises of universal education and the deeply questionable practice of eugenics. At least the main character sees how deeply problematic eugenics is. Mizora and the woman question. So now we've looked at Mary Bradley Lane and finally learned a bit about her. We've discussed the plot and details of the novel, but what does it say when looked at and compared within the larger late 19th century questions of evolution, heredity, and the woman question? Where does it fall within those bigger conversations? Well, let's look quickly at those details of the feminist and socialist utopia again. Its occupants want for nothing. The manual labor is fully mechanized, and Missouri inhabitants work by choice, not by coercion. Agriculture has been dispensed with. Food is now synthesized from the elements. Like, for example, bread comes from limestone. And universal education has been instantiated. Sounds great, right? Sure, but we can't forget that every utopia is someone's dystopia, and in this case, it should be every sane contemporary person's. Why to fear a future like Mizora? Well, Vera Zarevich finds herself constantly asking where all the men in her new home are in her new home, but is quickly taught that men are as undesirable as brunettes or dark-skinned people or criminals, all of whom have been, as Vera's tutors explain, that they were all simply eliminated. Jean Felser summarizes the book best yet again, and this is why we call her the expert and not me. Socialist and feminist it may be, but Mizora also delivers a racist and imperialistic destiny. Not only in its political promises, but also in its narrative of discovery and initiation. So again, we ask, how does this fit in with larger conversations about feminism and evolution in the late 19th century among women thinkers? Surprisingly cozily, as a matter of fact, according to Wendy Hayden, which is a rhetorician, in her dissertation, she talks about women's rights advocates using scientific developments in bacteriology, physiology, embryology, and heredity as warrants to bolster their claims of free love and feminist ideology. Her summary of this intersection of eugenics and feminism is the best I've found. But using an appeal to mothers of the race led to other developments, a rhetoric of feminist eugenics. In earlier texts, the type of eugenics advocated is the more positive kind. Feminists asserted a woman's right to choose a partner that would help her bear more fit offspring. Many rights could be advocated under this line of argument. However, towards the late 19th century, eugenics discourses became more racist and more deterministic. Later feminist advocates of eugenics, instead of using eugenics arguments for feminist ends, created arguments that championed more negative eugenics than positive eugenics. Eugenics became the end rather than the means to argue for feminist reforms. Of course, not all late 19th century feminists supported or endorsed eugenic ideals, but I feel that we've seen a decent concept of those important conversations and approaches to the fundamental issues those conversations dealt with thanks to Hayden. While some late 19th century feminist thinkers were developing ideas about evolutionary biology and purely deploying them for feminist goals, many were coupling these investigations into evolutionary biology with eugenicist theories to argue for their feminist goals. Sadder still, for many late 19th century and early 20th century feminist thinkers, the vector of justification inverted, and the feminist arguments came to serve the end goals of eugenic policies. And the conclusion. While Mizora, and by association its author, detailed a world in which women thrived and succeeded without the help of any man or dependence on fossil fuels, all while providing universal education and health care, we see now how extremely flawed the means of those successes are. Yes, while the inherent ideas of women's freedom did much for the feminist ideology at the time, many of those women pushing for those freedoms either didn't understand the severity of the eugenics roots or agreed, thus providing a great framework for us now in the 21st century to see how far we've come in both of those racial and feminist views. And then the rest is just we're excited, so I'll stop sharing. But yeah, anyway.